Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. Welcome to this Future of Place Roundtable, the first of 3 that we have scheduled over the coming months. My name is Adam Beck. I'm Executive Director of the Smart Cities Council for Australia and New Zealand, and also Program Lead for our Future of Place project. I would like to start by acknowledging the First Nations people as the original inhabitants of the land in which I'm participating in this meeting today in Brisbane, and I recognise the country north and south of the Brisbane River as the home to the Turrbal and Jagera nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. A couple of housekeeping matters. We're recording this session for those that haven't been able to make it today. If you are in a place that may be subject to background noise or distraction, please utilise the mute function. We will be having some interaction. I'd like to ask some questions throughout this roundtable to provoke some sort of feedback and also some dialogue. So a smart device of some description to be able to do some survey will be ideal, and also encourage you certainly to use the chat box. And indeed, you know, I would like to actually start there and get each of you to introduce yourselves using the chat box. If you want to pop your name and organisation in there, we'll get a sense of who we have on the line. And also the chat box will serve, as I mentioned, for questions. And indeed, if you wanted to sort of share any links with your fellow peers. So if everyone just wanted to drop their name and organisation, say hi there. Thank you, Stuart, calling in from Brisbane with Veris, and Sarah. Welcome, Sarah. If you wanted to just do that, I'll keep going with a few other little introductory housekeeping and contextual items. For those that may be a little bit new to the Future of Place project that we're in full force moving forward, Future of Place is looking to unpack these evolving and tightening relationships between people, place, technology and data. Certainly, if you haven't already, head to the Future of Place website to get a sense more about what we're doing, futureofplace.global. Our goals overall are to explore that change, that technology, data, people, place, relationships that's evolving. We want to explore that change. We want to share knowledge and insights about what we're thinking, what we're finding, what we're reading, what we're observing. And we want to provide guidance to really help enhance our policy and practice around these intersecting issues. And when I say provide guidance, one of our many goals is to create some sort of an artifact or resource that we're going to be able to share. It's a 2-year project where we're sort of notionally thinking that it's a handbook of some description, but time will tell what it looks like. We need to do some more discovery before we land on a table of contents. Some of you are part of our task force, and welcome to all our task force members that are helping shape that handbook. And of course, if you are keen to know more, certainly get in touch with us. So the topic of discussion today, e-mobility and city design. The topic is a really interesting one. Just to sort of set things up, a couple of images more than anything. There is no better example of the evolving, tightening, curious relationship between tech, data, people in place than e-mobility. It's a smartphone agenda. It's a cloud computing agenda. It's a moving people agenda. It's also a physical space and place agenda. It's an agenda that is helping shape infrastructure and planning decisions in local government councils across Australia and also New Zealand. And of course, it's an agenda that comes in many forms. It comes in 1 wheel, 2 wheels, 4 wheels, and many others. So we'll sort of explore a few of those and discuss those today. The roundtable goals: number one, knowledge sharing. Number two, have a conversation about the knowledge and information that we're sharing. And selfishly, from the Future of Place project's perspective, identify some priorities. We're going to be listening very clearly. We're recording this session. We view our roundtables as an opportunity to sort of ingest good ideas and priorities that we can take forward as part of the project. Today, and as with our future roundtables, we'll have content experts with us that are going to be providing commentary. There's a lot of familiar faces on the line that have deep awareness and understanding of this issue, and certainly encourage you as we get into the dialogue to share and contribute as required. But Stephen Coulter is with us today. I've asked Stephen to sort of kick us off with a bit of an introduction to help sort of get our dialogue and thinking sort of flowing a little bit. Stephen wears many hats. He's founder of Local Lift, co-founder of Zippity, convener of the Asia Pacific Micro-Mobility Alliance. And I have it on good word that his most favorite role in life is as a member of the mobility team for the Future of Place task force, for which he actively participates. So Stephen, thanks so much for joining us today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to set a bit of a scene, share some expert thoughts and commentary, and I'm going to pick up after you. So I'll just stop sharing here for a moment, and you should be able to take controls and share a few slides. Over to you.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Are you now seeing my screen?
If you just want to put it in slideshow mode.
Yep.
We should be, yep, that's the one.
All good?
Perfect, Stephen. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Good morning, everyone. So a little bit about Zippity. We've been working in micromobility for about 3 or 4 years and transport for 7 or 8. And with Zippity, we focus on strategic consulting around micromobility. And as you can see on this covering slide, micromobility these days is 1, 2, 4-wheel devices, as Adam said, from bikes to scooters to cargo bikes to new things that are popping up like pods and stuff like that aren't here yet, and unicycles and one-wheels. And we do strategic consulting to governments, to major corporations, manufacturers and retailers in the space. We do it globally. And we also have a high focus on insurance. So we're providing insurance to operators of shared fleets of micromobility devices all around the world. We've dealt with people from Latin America to North America, the Middle East, Europe, Australia and Asia. So we get we're informed from lots of sources. And I guess particularly through COVID, initially we saw a lot of micromobility stop with the shutdowns, but then it was seen as an opportunity. And bikes in particular have had a huge surge through micromobility, e-bikes in particular, and also cargo bikes. And we think bikes and cargo bikes are going to be huge components of future transport for cities. And e-scooters have also rebounded. But I think e-scooters were the poster child 12, 18 months ago. Bikes are nudging them now, as are cargo bikes. So you've really got 3 broad types of vehicles being looked at from a city's perspective. The reason why that's happening is that cars dominate cities. Sorry, this is an old slide. I didn't realize the transition was so slow. But let me see if I can hasten that. Cars dominate around the world. And if you just look at Sydney, there's over 1.5 billion journeys a year of 2 kilometres or less, 3.5 billion that are 5 kilometres or less, and only 1.5 billion journeys are more than 10 kilometres. So and if you take Australia and New Zealand, you could probably multiply the Sydney number by 2 or 3 to get to the regional total. So short journeys dominate. They're typically cars, and they're mostly driver-only cars without a passenger. And all of these journeys are really well suited to forms of e-mobility. The challenge in e-mobility is to have the vehicles available that can adequately replace a car for those types of short journeys. And we're seeing lots of vehicles starting to appear. Some are legal, most are still illegal in lots of Australia, but you need alternatives to cars that can handle hills, heavier riders, older people, commuters that want to get to work without arriving in a sweat and without needing to get out of their lycra and have a shower. And you need bikes that can handle cargo. So a lot of these sorts of tasks, if we're really going to be successful, are going to require more power than current laws require. But a lot of the current manufacturers have been very clever in how they've engineered their electric bikes and scooters and cargo bikes to give sufficient torque and power for most activities as they currently exist. So that's not a barrier to adoption. It probably will just slow the uptake until we get some better standards here. We need government support at all levels if we think we're going to maximise the adoption of e-forms of vehicle in place of cars. Within Australia, there's roles for all levels of government. Right now, the most immediate thing is the National Transport Commission in Australia has been doing research into e-mobility, particularly scooters and personal mobility devices since 2018. They've now come up with a set of model laws that are going to Australia's federal and state transport ministers in May. And if they get approved in May, which is what is expected, then there will be a set of model laws each state can adopt to have consistent laws around vehicle standards and types, particularly around scooters, electric skateboards, and EPMDs. These new road rules don't cover e-bikes. They're everything except the bikes. But a number of states have been waiting for some leadership on this to come from the NTC. So hopefully that will be approved, which will allow states to adopt it and have consistency around Australia and allow more vehicles to be legally used than is currently the case. Above and beyond that, we think the federal government needs to continue to evolve the standards to allow more powerful and a better range of bikes and cargo bikes in particular to take over more roles that cars currently play. We think at a federal level, there's opportunities for tax and other financial incentives, which most of the rest of the world is doing for e-bikes and e-scooters, but hasn't happened yet in any meaningful way in Australia. And we think infrastructure is something that needs to be addressed at all levels. I think too often bike infrastructure and bike lanes have been left largely to local governments. And what we've ended up with in most parts of Australia is a join the dots scenario where you have good bike lanes for short distances, but they don't connect. And for people to get from where they live to their jobs often requires them to join traffic on roads. And we know one of the major barriers to bike adoption is riders don't feel safe on roads. So infrastructure is a really important thing to address that going forwards, having better facilities for bikes and people riding other sorts of electric vehicles. At a state level, we think there's also opportunity to have better transport incentives to integrate e-mobility, whether it's privately owned or shared, as part of the transit system of a state. So if you're having this incentive for somebody to transfer from one form of public transport to another, those same sort of incentives should apply if people have invested in their own asset to do that part of the journey. And then as we get down to a more local level, where there needs to be continued focus on having better local infrastructure and reallocating road space, but also local speed limits starting to play a really big factor and to make riders feel safer. So if we flip forwards, we think the really short-term opportunities, firstly, to reduce rider fear of roads, and lower speed limits are really important there. And around Australia, 30 kilometres is starting to be trialled and adopted in some cities, in high pedestrian areas and also in residential streets. And there is a lot of science behind why it is 30 kilometres an hour. And that's in the case of an accident at 30 kilometres an hour, the risk of death to a pedestrian is under 5%. You go to 40%, 40 kilometres an hour, and the risk of death is near 50%. You get to 60 kilometres an hour, it's virtually 100%. So 30 is a magic number in terms of speeds less than that. There are far less accidents because traffic is moving slower. The severity of injury when they do occur is far less. And if you're riding a bike or a scooter or another PMD in that sort of speed zone, you're much closer to the speed of traffic, so it becomes safer and feels safer to riders. So that's something that can be done quickly without major cost. We think protected bike lanes are a really important thing, and a lot of local governments have started doing that around Australia. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane have all been putting in bike lanes through COVID. Some of them pop up, some of them permanent, but we think the pop-ups will largely become permanent because that is becoming a core trend around the world now that so many more people are working from home. There are more local journeys. You need to accommodate that. We think there's also opportunity to have more shared pathways on footpaths. While footpaths are shunned by some, there are some LGAs in Australia that have great footpaths that don't have a lot of pedestrians that could be used for cyclists and other riders. But each LGA can designate a footpath as a shared pathway if they feel it's appropriate. So there are things that can be done at relatively low cost. We think the other stuff that can be done locally is, from a leadership perspective, is LGAs and local businesses can start using bikes as part of their transport fleet in lieu of cars and other forms of mobility. So local government bike fleets and cargo bike fleets. In the UK, this is a very big thing. A lot of local governments will have fleets of up to 200 cargo bikes that they use, but also make available for local business use to get vans and trucks out of strip shopping centres and out of local government areas. You can incent local use through providing better parking and access. The other thing that's happening and can actually happen here is that there's been an Australian Tax Office ruling that employees who salary sacrifice an e-bike can have it FBT free. So there are ways that employers can support employees in having e-bikes to get to and from their jobs as well, not just for business use. The other bigger problem is linking the local infrastructure where it exists, which requires a more coordinated effort between local, state and federal governments, of federal and state governments providing funding to LGAs to build local bike paths and to link the ones that are there so you can have end-to-end journeys without going into danger zones between the dots where they don't currently connect. So I think as a start point, that's really a scene setter. I'm happy to take any questions or just go back to Adam and let Adam facilitate from here and talk about these issues and others that come up.
Yeah, Stephen, thanks for that sort of scene setter. And for our guests, would love to get your thoughts and reactions to sort of kick things off. I'm going to monitor the chat box. I also encourage anyone to take themselves off mute and identify themselves, introduce themselves, and then whether you have a question or a comment. I have some questions queued up shortly that I wanted to get some feedback on, but I want to start by just seeing if anyone had any introductory remarks to make. We do have a question or set of questions coming here from Manji. Stephen, can bike tracks follow rail lines as the grading is better suited? And then also, can a reward scheme be developed for active transport, e.g. dollars per kilometre travelled, car usage? Okay, so a bit of a sort of grouping of questions there from Manji. Any quick responses to that one, Stephen, before we open up to others?
Certainly, rail trails there's a lot of LGAs that are putting in rail trails, turning rail trails into bike paths. We've just moved to the Geelong area, and there's a 32-kilometre one from the Geelong to Queenscliff down here, and there are others about. So Manji is correct that the slope of rails is good for bikes where they're available, but they're possibly more often or not more regional, these sort of ones. They're not always going to be rail trails in CBD areas where you can connect, but where that's an opportunity, it's certainly good. And I guess going forwards, it's when you're building rail trails, railways and rail lines, can you have a bike path nearby and leverage the cost of that infrastructure investment?
Thanks, Stephen. I wanted to quickly ask you, in some sort of a summary fashion, from a city design perspective, what's your view or take on the existing public realm, our existing sort of infrastructure, more broadly? Are our cities designed for micromobility?
I guess the short answer is no. They're designed for cars and they have been for 100 years. But that doesn't mean they can't be adapted for micromobility relatively quickly. And what we're seeing in parts of Europe, road space being dramatically reallocated away from cars towards pedestrians, towards community, and towards riders of different types of vehicles. That can be done. The big issue for government is the car lobby and how to confront that. But there's got to be a realization soon that cars are being used far too much. When you look at the statistics I put up earlier on the number of journeys that are less than 2 kilometres and less than 5 kilometres, there just isn't a need for cars to be used. It's because we've made cities too car friendly, that trend is happening. And now we're seeing when you put another lane on a freeway, it makes traffic better for a short period of time, but within 3 or 4 years, it largely gets back to the delays it had beforehand, because it's induced demand is the technical term, which many of you will be familiar with. We're inducing demand from cars for building more car facilities. If you start taking it away and having incentives for other forms of transport, as we've seen through COVID in some parts of the world, the migration can happen quickly.
Absolutely. Friends, let's sort of provoke a bit of dialogue here. I'm going to bring up on the screen a link to our mentee survey that I've got set up. Hopefully you're familiar with these online polling platforms. There's a QR code there you can scan. You can also just go into mentee.com and you can see the code there. I've got the first question up and ready to go. I'll just give you a moment. And here is the. Let me bring it up. Here's our first question up there. Let's sort of ease our way into this. So again, mentee.com on any device. The code is up there, 9996921. The first question, just a little bit about the group we have here. What's your primary interest in e-mobility? Sorry, the font's so tiny there, but is it policy making? Is it urban planning and infrastructure design? An e-mobility user? You're just a curious bystander or curious urbanist in this topic, or some other primary interest or primary role? It seems like most of us are in the business of planning and infrastructure design. For those that are clicking other, would love you just to drop in the chat box there, data analyst. Okay, thanks Mushtaq for that. Would love to hear what other primary interests in e-mobility you have that are in the other category that a few people have mentioned. We've got a couple of policymakers on the line. So Stephen, we've got a bit of a diversity here, which is fantastic. Let's keep going through. Next question, a bit of a temperature test question to all of you. Does your local authority have an e-mobility strategy? Yes, no, or unsure? I'm very interested in this one. Does your local council authority have an e-mobility strategy? Stephen, is anything surprising you here?
Not really. I guess from the LGAs I've been involved with, a lot of them are starting to put policies in place for shared bikes or shared scooters, but they don't have a systemic e-mobility strategy which would support private people who own their own devices, which is going to be the bulk of the market over time.
Is there any that do exist that you really like, that you've seen in Australia or New Zealand at a local authority level?
Not that I can think of top of mind.
Okay. Okay. Georgie Johnson has asked a great question in the chat box. Can those that do have a policy share a link to their strategies? Georgie, a crowdsourced question there. I know Brisbane City Council recently released a draft. I know that's still online as a draft in both PDF. There it is there. Bryden has put that.
That looks good.
Put that in there. Yeah, nice one. Like 12 pages. You know, short, sharp, straight to the point. Okay, friends, thanks for sharing your views on that question. Let's dig a little bit deeper. What do you believe are the primary benefits that will result in greater uptake? It's a bit of a prioritization one. Shafani has also put in the chat box there a link to what seems to be a roadmap around shared mobility for New Zealand. Thanks for sharing, Shafani. What do you believe are the primary benefits that will result in greater uptake? What's going to be the core value proposition? Stephen, is this in line with what you're seeing or hearing? Expected, unexpected? Any views?
Research around the world says that sustainability isn't a motivation to change. It's going to be convenience and affordability and safety that drive it. Sustainability is a feel good, but it doesn't motivate behavior change.
So those local authorities that are, you know, like Brisbane City Council that has identified the opportunity, they have pilots, they have now a draft strategy. They're doing this because, fill in the blank for me, Stephen.
They're doing it because I think they want it. Well, they're a big LGA. They want to have consistency across their LGA. They want to provide some guidance to business on how to best fit into their LGA in terms of transport. And I think, you know, as an LGA, that sustainability is a driver for government, but so they need to put it out there. But it's, as I said before, it's not a motivator that's going to result in significant behaviour change out of cars to bikes or other or scooters.
Okay. And just the next question, and then we'll probably we'll sort of dwell on this one a little bit when we get some responses in. Looking to the future, which do you see as the most popular e-mobility devices? E-bike, and I've got a little bit of a differentiator there between recreation and commute and micro freight, like the cargo bikes, e-scooter, the e-skateboard and sort of other boards. We've seen those one-wheelers, and I've just put other in there for those that are well more versed in the different devices than myself. But what do you think are going to be the most popular sort of over time and looking forward? Stephen, you made a comment in your introduction while we're getting votes in there. And it was mentioned to me at a conference a while ago that the e-scooter is the gateway drug, and then comes the bike and sort of the others. What's sort of behind that? Is it just sort of, you know, what everyone else is doing or not doing, or is there some real technical or policy elements to sort of scooters and now the greater uptake of the e-bike?
Look, I think the great factor about e-scooters is they're fun. Whenever, unless they have a fall on their first ride, everybody gets off the scooter on their first ride smiling. It's really good fun. It's probably got some, Hugh Mackay would probably say it's probably got some fallback to your childhood, remembering riding a kick scooter as a kid. It's a fun way to get around. And they're really good for short distances. But if we need to go more than probably a couple of kilometres, bikes are a more practical vehicle. And the scooters are still, they're evolving very rapidly, but they, you know, they've got small wheels, they don't handle bumps well, you don't really have an easy place to put luggage other than a backpack or a shoulder bag. So we think scooters will evolve quickly, but probably bikes are going to be, with better infrastructure coming in, will remain the dominant vehicle, but scooters will certainly grow.
This e-bike, this second one here around micro freight, and the cargo bikes, one thing that of course has been there in the background for a long time, but COVID certainly, sort of really brought it to the sort of the forefront is sort of e-commerce and our digital lifestyle in terms of purchasing things. And I can only imagine the number of courier vans that are cycling through our city streets, delivering everything from shampoo and toenail clippers to anything else that we find on Amazon. Where is the micro freight cargo bike agenda at in your mind?
Well, the really big vehicle in that space has been the e-bikes for delivery food riders. That's just exploded through COVID with food delivery. So the food delivery riders are tending to look for robust bikes, and they're more your traditional e-bike, but there are versions coming out that are more robust with better battery life. They're not really yet going towards the micro freight bikes. At the moment in Australia, the best micro freight bikes tend to be either what's known as a long tail bike that's got like a long rack at the back, and you'll often see them being used more for families. You can get 2 or 3 young kids sitting on the back of a bike on a long tail. And overseas, they're starting to be used for freight. But here, they're an expensive bike. They're mostly, somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000, and the same for the other quality cargo bikes with the big boxes. So they're not taking off in a big way yet, but there are some on the horizon that are likely to come in at a lower price point. And we think also that that's an area where government could really offer some incentives, because they're really practical. They can take a lot of vans and trucks out of local areas, but the price is an issue to get into that space at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Just on e-commerce and sort of that last mile freight, I am anticipating that there's going to be a perfect storm of sort of conflicting issues here as we sort of start to slowly unpack and identify the role of the curb in our cities. And we held a discovery session for those that were on that session a month or two ago. The curbside is a really sort of ground zero part of the public realm in terms of, hotly contested for space, right? Whether it's parking scooters, whether it's stationary cars that are parked, whether it's delivery vans. I've seen statistics that sort of, Uber pick up and drop off, 78% of them are done in the middle of the road. They can't actually access the curb. We want to now introduce e-bikes potentially with micro freight. It's a WWF smackdown all over again, isn't it? Sort of accessing the curb, and sort of lanes and more vehicles needing to be parked.
I think this is back to the debate over car space versus other road users, and you've seen a lot of cities now move, either reduce parking or move bikes and other vehicles away from footpaths by having a curbside cycle lane with parking beyond it, so that you can preserve some parking but also give a much better protected lane for bikes, or it could be for freight delivery using cargo bikes.
Yeah, absolutely. Friends, feel free to use the chat box. Also, feel free to take yourself off mute, introduce yourself, and certainly ask any questions or make any comments. While we do that, I'm going to head to another question here around the most challenging aspect to accelerating e-mobility adoption. What are your views on this, friends, when it comes to barriers and challenges? What are you observing? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? I know we do have some policymakers that are on the line. And if anyone wanted to sort of verbally share their views on this one as well, I'd love to hear more. I'm hoping it's not just going to be regulatory barriers. That's sort of the staple, isn't it, Stephen? Those fundamental issues, as Stuart has also mentioned in the chat box there around helmets. That's one we've been fighting for decades now, I suppose.
Yeah, And look, I think at the moment, bike use in Australia for journeys is typically well under 10%, and where in Europe there are no helmet laws required. Transport becomes safer when it's adopted in mass. So if you're in Germany or in the Netherlands and you have far more people cycling, it's actually a lot safer than having the odd cyclists. They've even found in transport studies, cities that have introduced buses initially have a lot more bus accidents because drivers don't see buses because they're not looking for them. So whether it's a large vehicle or a scooter or a bike, it's when they're new or not in a large number, they're most dangerous.
Yes. Sarah, I've seen you put your hand up there. Hello, welcome.
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm having some tech issues with my laptop, so I'm doing it off the phone, which is interesting. I guess one of the things as well around infrastructure is also parking at home. So while we've got an increasing density of population, one of the problems for people is where do they park their bike or e-bike or e-scooter or whatever that is. And I think that we're seeing a drop in bicycle ownership or e-bike ownership, or where do you put your cargo bike in particular, if you haven't got a dedicated garage to put it in. We haven't solved that problem. You do see them in places like London where cycle people have got a product where they've got an on-street, they take out a parking bay and create a covered, secured bike parking area. I'm not aware of that product being supplied in Australia. And again, it's that contest over curbside allocation, but that's definitely a barrier. And anecdotally, just chatting to a couple of people who have got e-bikes in Sydney recently, they understand that it's not legal, but they've said, well, I live in an apartment with a walk-up flat and there's no way I can carry a bike up those stairs. I got an e-scooter instead. So I think that's part of the equation as well for the consumer.
Yeah. Sarah, is your view that our cities are designed for e-mobility at the moment?
No, not at all. I think we need to be thinking about that infrastructure from both. So about 70% of the Australian population say they would ride a bike under the right if it felt safe to do so. And e-bikes solve a whole lot of problems, or e-mobility in general, solve a lot of problems for people like sweating or hills, being able to carry things, etc. So it solves a whole lot of problems, but it doesn't solve that feeling of safety. And that's where that infrastructure has to come in to build what we refer to as the sort of the micromobility lanes. So they're not necessarily mixing with pedestrians, because I think there is a fair bit of incompatibility there around speed. But you're also not mixing with general traffic either. So, and there may be other solutions as well. In the Netherlands, they have a lot of streets that are under 30 kilometres an hour that are mixed traffic. But again, we've been reluctant in Australia to pursue that so far. But I think that that's certainly on the horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. Friends, I'd like to share a little a little website screenshot here. This is Christchurch City Council. I'm just going to play this. This is the heat map of e-scooters and e-bikes. And if you sort of take it back, I think it goes to when they started, which is October 2018. I sort of watched this as a non-practicing urban planner from way back and think to myself, wow, you know, what kind of tool does something like this now enable us to do as urban planners and designers and infrastructure, sort of designers. Does someone want to share a comment on what does one do with this now that we have this information and at times in real time, and you'll see this, it grows over time. Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I think this is a really great example of the technology that's in the shared fleets that this data is coming from. But we see most consumer e-bikes and e-scooters within 3 years are going to have at least basic IoT built into them. So you'll get this data also from privately owned bikes, scooters, and other vehicles. And it's fantastic for showing cities where to prioritise spend to put in bike tracks or micromobility lanes that aren't there, because they can see where they're going to be most utilised.
Yeah, yeah. As we watch this continue to unfold on the screen, would love any views of our guests to share, given that the majority of us on the line indicated that we were into sort of urban planning and infrastructure design. How might one use this kind of tool or data now? Does anyone want to share any views or thoughts themselves?
Adam, I could
Yes,
share.
Mark. We'll go Mark, then Magdi. Yep.
So, I mean, what I think that should motivate regulators to do in a city like Christchurch, as in fact they've done, is keep the regulations to a minimum. I put regulation at the bottom of that last poll because of the experience generally in New Zealand, but particularly in Auckland and Christchurch, where they've seen that kind of growth and thought, well, how can we enable this? And it's not by the multiplicity of rules that I think has generally been the modus operandi in most other cities. So you can ride scooters anywhere in New Zealand. I mean, there are some sort of, there's an issue with dedicated bike lanes, bizarrely, but those of us like me who e-scooter every day just ignore that, and the police just ignore the fact that we're breaking the rules. So I think there's a kind of an imperative from a regulatory point of view that this kind of technology should seek to enable, and the focus should go on what I put as being the top barrier, and that is the existing infrastructure, right? The existing footpaths are rubbish, and the roads are congested, and so trying to get some separation, as Sarah was saying, should be the priority focus if we want to enable more activity.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Magdi, you sort of had your hand up as well, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Thanks. Well, it's a comment, but also as a question to Stephen. In relation to the regulations, I practiced urban planning in local and state government, and I can see from my experience that nothing will actually happen seriously unless there is codes and compulsory regulations by the state government that passes down to the local government. And that's about the road design itself, as well as the availability of safe lanes for micro-mobility, etc. In Japan right now, they're designing roads with 3 separate lanes, one for pedestrian and micro-mobility, one for normal cars, and one for self-driven vehicle. So it is happening overseas in a very small way, but it is a start. Why can't our state governments create an authority, and they have traffic authorities, each one of them, to look into that and start to develop a code through a task force or whatever it is, and pass that code as a compulsory code, and that can be developed further as technology progress. Why can't we do that?
Stephen, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Yeah, I think Sarah might be a better place to answer this one, but I think it's a bit of a push me pull you with local government and states at the moment, depending what state you're in. Some states are more progressive than others. Some are wanting local governments to push back to the state and say, can you support us on this or give us an exemption to do these sorts of trials. Other local governments are waiting for the state to lead. I agree, it's unclear. I think to Mark's point, in New Zealand, if we wait for a regulatory change, that's going to be the slowest way to make change. Some of the tools we have now already are 30-kilometre speed limits, as they have in Europe. And I think ultimately pedestrians and bikes and scooters don't mix. So you've got to prioritise pedestrians for footpaths. But if you have 30-kilometre speed limits in residential and high pedestrian areas, then that makes it much safer for bikes and scooters. And then you need to then get the protected micro-mobility lanes onto the faster roads, which is the longest, requires some infrastructure, but that infrastructure build is far cheaper than building roads or rail. And I think the great thing through COVID is that with more people doing more local journeys, the governments need to prioritise short-term infrastructure over long-term infrastructure right now, because it also creates local jobs, whereas building roads and rail often goes to offshore companies and doesn't support the local economy to the same extent.
Okay, thanks for that. Jeff, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, that was interesting, that heat map. I wonder if the increased traffic was people commuting from where they live to the city and taking their e-scooter with them and then transiting around the city on an e-scooter. And I know I've got a couple of friends that do that rather than commuting on an e-scooter from an outer or inner suburb. So I'm not sure about that heat map, if that represents that or not, but it'd be interesting to understand. I know in my local area, which is Williamstown, there's a lot more people on e-bikes and e-scooters, just generally going down to the shops and that sort of thing. So I've definitely seen an increase there. Some of those e-bikes actually can go at quite a speed. So I'm sort of nervous about the road safety impacts of those bikes that are sort of a slow motorbike in some regards, how they would be impacted on road safety. The other comment I raise is about on the Clara project, which is a Greenfield Smart City project, we actually designed a dedicated lane for e-mobility. And that was more at the pavement walking level rather than on the road, because that eliminated the issue of kiss and ride parking, autonomous vehicles and doors opening and closing, and how people egress those types of trackless trams and things in the future. So we did put mobility on the pavement, but it was a dedicated lane for e-mobility. And it just got around the issue of people transiting from one type of mode to the other. What I'd be interested to understand is on greenfield sites, it's now obviously far easier to plan and accommodate this, but are developers and planners actually doing that? Because I think there's a real missed opportunity with some of the developments I've seen where they haven't actually considered the rise in e-mobility, and they're still designing a typical type of road and footpath intersection.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great point, particularly with greenfield and new urban developments. I imagine even if private sector developers are leading those, ultimately the city council then takes over management and ownership. But any views around that topic, I'd love to hear if anyone has any greenfield sort of stories there. Did anyone have anything to add to that? Okay. Maybe over time we might need to sort of unpack that a little bit.
Adam, what we've done
Sarah.
in New South Wales, we've just released the new cycleway design toolbox that's publicly available. And what we've done there is in the New South Wales context, or particularly in Sydney, we tend to have quite a limited 12.8 metre curb to curb width that's very difficult and constrained to fit in cycleways. But then we've also created permutations where if you do have, particularly for greenfield, you've got the opportunity to put in wider micromobility lanes, then that guidance is actually available. So if it's helpful, I can try and pop it into the chat if I can figure out how to do that on my phone.
Yeah, I've just gone. It's pretty. I just googled NSW cycle toolbox and it came up, but it goes straight to the PDF. But I'm sure it's in there somewhere, and someone will pop it on. A couple more questions I'd just like to sort of get some views on. Can I ask you this somewhat provocative question with respect to being world leaders in e-mobility? How strongly do you agree or disagree with these comments? And statements, and what I've done here is, where are we at with policy making around this? Urban planning, so planning for strategic outcomes, urban infrastructure design, and then the last one is around public realm management and facilitating outcomes. I'd love you to take a moment and rate each of those statements, and we'll sort of see where they land. Stephen, thanks for popping that NSW cycleway design toolbox in there, and Sarah, thanks for bringing our attention to that. Stephen, as the numbers sort of go in here and you look at what's happening online, obviously the policy making is taking a bit of a beating.
Yeah,
Seems
well,
like, yeah.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I think, you know, the people on this call and lots of our transport people do understand what best practice is. So there's not a lack of access to best practice and being able to design for it. But I think there are some issues in the public policy area and public realm about actually doing it.
Yeah, okay. So obviously some stronger views there that as practitioners, if we were given the task we could execute on planning and designing and building the infrastructure, whether the demand and leadership is there is questionable. The policy making is a bit challenging. The last one's an interesting one, you know, public realm managers. And we've had a couple of cities in Australia and New Zealand for a while now, a good couple of years. Brisbane, Darwin, what have we got in New Zealand, Mark? We've got what, Christchurch and Auckland, I think, have got schemes in multi-year schemes. Yeah, okay. So we've had some good time to sort of work out how we manage this, perceptions, incidents, a whole range of other things. Stephen, from that management perspective, a scheme is up and running and it's happening. Key observations and thoughts about how it's kind of going, and maybe any particular key issues we need to have in our blind spot?
Are you thinking from a Brisbane, Darwin's, or the cities already doing it perspective?
Yeah. I mean, what can we learn from the cities that have had these for years now?
Well, I think the data that's coming out of those cities is showing that there has been transfer of people out of cars onto these things, onto bikes and scooters for access to transit for shorter journeys. So promoting the data that the change has actually made to more sustainable transport based on fact is much better than just the theory of it. So there's a lot of that out there. I think early on, there's still a lot of negative emotive opinion about safety and danger. And I think that needs to be hit on the head to some extent, because a lot of the surveys and data that journalists are still putting out there relate to 3 or 4 years ago. And we're now up to, you know, 4th generation scooters that have, in some cases, over 100 sensors and are far safer than most other vehicles these days. But there's a lot of old data still being played out from some sides to try and stop this from happening.
Yeah.
So New Zealand's a really good place for this because they have the Accident Compensation Commission. They have much better data than most cities around the world on accidents, not just from scooters, but from bikes, from rugby, from skateboards, from kick scooters, from everything, to show the incidents compared to other activities. Whereas most reports you see around the world highlight the accidents from scooters without putting context around it of how many accidents happen on bikes or skateboards or playing sport or falling downstairs. So New Zealand is actually one of the better places to bring that data together, because everything gets reported there.
Yeah. Interesting comment by Stuart here around the greenfield sort of view of the world and e-mobility. He's saying that developers he's working with often see e-mobility as only an inner city kind of option or agenda. It is an interesting question, isn't it? When will we see sort of the first e-scooter or e-bike, you know, sharing schemes out in the burbs, so to speak? It'll certainly be a brave local authority that goes there, but one I think certainly worthy of
But actually, Adam, on that
observing.
one,
Yes, Sarah.
there are a couple of examples. So Biko in Newcastle works well with the light rail, where it sort of integrates with light rail and expands the catchment. And I think that's a really good example of where e-mobility can help, particularly in sort of regional areas or relatively low density suburbia, because you could, in theory, expand your catchment to those stations and those centres through particularly shared mobility, where you might integrate. And I think Uber's had some examples of this with Jump in the US and in Europe before they shed that business model. But instead of providing, say, local feeder buses, if you're encouraging or subsidising shared e-mobility, that could expand your catchment to your public transport. So it's all part of that mobility as a service offering.
Yeah, I do understand that Brisbane City Council is about to trial an end-of-mile suburban-based e-scooter kind of pilot. So having them near one of the transit stations in sort of outer suburbs, see how it goes as an end-of-mile solution. I invited them to be part of this, but I haven't heard back yet. So I'll certainly share that. Friends, we're almost at time, and it's quite incredible how quickly an hour goes, and by no means were we going to deal with sort of everything in the e-mobility world in 1 hour. Just quickly, a couple of final points before we drop off and what happens from here. We've got a couple of other roundtables coming up, one around artificial intelligence and city design, and also 5G and city design. So certainly encourage you to sort of come along and take part in those if those topics certainly seem of interest. Our monthly discovery sessions continue. Again, head to the website. Whole range of topics coming up between now and the end of the year in our monthly discovery session exercise. Our Future of Place Summit in Brisbane, August 25th. Early bird tickets are on sale right now. Go and check that out. Follow us if you're not on all of those social things. Podcasts, you'll find that on your favorite podcast platform. Episode 1 is up and running. Our terms of reference, more to come soon. Weekly updates, futureofplace.global. You can subscribe there if you're not. I'll take a big breath. That's it from me. It's noon on the clock here. Everyone, thank you so much for joining in. We will share the recording, the chat box, and the notes that have come out of this. More to come, I believe. We need to unpack this a little bit more. I hope it's been valuable, an hour worth spent today. Thank you so much again for your time. We'll look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.